Good morning again. You know, we're all familiar with the age-old philosophical question, if a tree falls in the woods, but nobody is present, does it make a sound, right? And the answer is, of course, that it does. What you may not be familiar with is there's a similar age-old philosophical question. It sounds something like this, that if a man makes a statement and a woman is not present to hear him make that statement, is he still wrong anyway? And the answer is, of course he is. The man, right? So now I recognize that joke is probably not politically correct for some reason, but it is funny. And it's funny to me personally for the reason that there are occasions when my wife Leanna and I are talking about something and we have just completely contradictory recollection of the facts. Does anybody else have that? Okay, it's apparently just us. But it couldn't be more contradictory. Their house was blue. No, Kent, their house is yellow. No, it's blue. I was just there. I know. Their house is blue. It's yellow, right? And then, I later come to find out that the house was in fact yellow. Yellow, and I was so absolutely convinced. It's mystifying me. I was so absolutely convinced, but I was completely so hard to say that word, that R word. I could swear, you're so absolutely convinced, I could swear their house was blue. I could just swear it. I knew that it was blue. It used to be blue. No, it never was blue. It was always yellow. It's brick. It's a yellow brick house. It was never blue. How did I get it in my brain that it was blue? Only God knows, Kent, what you get in your brain, right? It can be absolutely unsettling when you're just absolutely convinced about something only to find that you are absolutely dead wrong. Absolutely dead wrong. Well, there's a disconcerting connection with our passage this morning in John chapter 9. And here we're going to see a group of people who are just absolutely convinced about the way they were seeing things, but they were absolutely dead wrong. They were absolutely convinced about the way that they saw Jesus, but the fact of the matter is they were completely seeing Jesus wrongly. They thought that they were right, but they were spiritually blind. And the question that this passage confronts us with this morning is, am I doing the same thing that they're doing? Am I just absolutely convinced that I got it right about Jesus, that I'm seeing Jesus rightly, but the fact of the matter is I'm dead wrong. I'm not seeing Jesus rightly. Are we spiritually blind? And now I just want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because I'm speaking with a heart of concern for us as a church family. It's this question of how we see Jesus is becoming more and more important in our culture. And I say that because it's becoming more and more common for people to embrace a certainty about the way they see Jesus, when in fact the way they see Jesus bears very little resemblance to what Jesus is actually like. With the result that in our culture it's becoming more and more common for people to embrace a Christian faith that bears very little resemblance to the actual teachings of Jesus. And I believe that we're going to continue to see then this increasingly sharp divide in the days and months and years to come between an authentic Christianity on the one hand, and on the other hand, this increasingly spiritually blind cultural religiosity. a cultural spirituality that may be Christian in name, but not in substance. We're seeing that happen in our culture, and I believe it's going to happen more and more, and we don't want to be on the wrong path. We don't want to be found on the pathway of the spiritually blind, and so because this condition of spiritual blindness is so eternally dangerous, our passage this morning invites us into a difficult conversation. Have I become spiritually blind? Am I certain that I know how it is with Jesus, but I'm completely wrong? And if I am, how do I come to see Jesus rightly? And so what we're going to do is we're going to watch this morning's Bible passage as portrayed in the motion picture, The Gospel of John. If you've been around, we've watched this before. The narrative, I like this because it's, first of all, more interesting than listening to me read the Bible passage, and also helpful because the script for the motion picture is word for word from the Bible itself. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pick up with the motion picture at the beginning of John chapter 9 and verse 1, which is what we looked at last week, where Jesus healed a man who had been born blind. And what we're going to see as this scene continues to unfold is that what was the healing of an individual's physical blindness becomes a picture of spiritual healing, the healing of spiritual blindness. And as we watch this scene unfold, this is what I want you to look for. I want you to pay attention to this contrast that unfolds between, this blind beggar who progresses to become somebody who sees rightly, and the contrast against these religious people who are certain about their religiosity, who progress from their absolute certainty about how they see down a pathway towards actually greater spiritual blindness, because we don't want to go there. And so let's watch the clip and ask ourselves, which path am I on? Let's roll the clip. So what we see unfold in this scene is this contrast between the beggar and the religious people. The beggar progressed physically from blindness to seeing, but he also progressed spiritually from blindness to seeing. And I just want to touch on some observations that came straight out of the man's mouth in this scene. And that was the entirety of John chapter 9, by the way, that we just watched. So this blind beggar progressed from, first of all, recognizing that Jesus was a man in verse 11, to verse 17, seeing Jesus as a prophet, and then in verse 33, recognizing that Jesus could not have done what he did had he not been from God. And this phrase, from God, is an important phrase in this chapter. It's used by the blind beggar. It's used by the religious people. And in this context, being from God means, what is the source of what Jesus is saying? What is the source of his teachings? What is the source of who he is? And being from God ultimately is shorthand for Jesus is God. And Jesus' words are the words of God. And the blind man progressed spiritually to, this logical conclusion. He couldn't heal a blind man if he were not from God. And then finally, the blind man progressed to seeing Jesus as Lord. And we saw there at the end of the chapter that he bowed his life down before Jesus and worshiped him. In verse 38. And so the beggar progressed not only from spirit or physical blindness to physical seeing, physical sight, but from spiritual blindness to spiritual sight. But on the other hand, in contrast, the religious people progressed in a completely different direction. They moved, from their starting point, from a place of certainty that Jesus was not from God. Verse 16, his words aren't the words of God. He's not from God. What he's doing, the healing of a blind man, is not from God. They were certain of that. And they moved in verse 22 to certainty that anyone who followed then the teachings of Jesus should be expelled, from the synagogue, put out of the synagogue. All right, let me give you a modern way to frame what they just did. Anyone who follows Jesus should be expelled from the synagogue. Religious people think that anyone who blindly follows the teachings of Jesus should be marginalized from the society of the enlightened. Anyone who follows the teachings of Jesus blindly are imbeciles. They are threats to society, and they should be marginalized to the lunatic fringe. That might sound familiar these days. In verse 24, the religious people progressed to certainty that Jesus was a sinner. They knew. They said they knew, as any intelligent person knows, that not only does Jesus not speak the words of God, but Jesus is not God himself, because they knew, they were absolutely 100% certain that they've got some dirt on Jesus that nullifies his claim that he is God. And then finally in verse 34, we see the religious people progress to the point of attacking this man who does not see things their way. Modern framework again. If you don't agree with the way we see how life works, if you don't agree with the way, that we see spirituality, you're an imbecile. Who are you to teach us? Who are you to contradict what we have come to see rightly? If you don't see things our way, you are intolerant. Does that sound like a modern framework? Agree with us, or else. So in contrast then to the beggar, these religious people progress into greater and greater depths of certainty, and into greater depths of spiritual darkness and spiritual blindness. And this is the important part to listen to, because the issue that the progression down this pathway towards spiritual sight, or progression down the pathway towards spiritual blindness, what the progression hinges on in this chapter and in our lives, it all hinges on the answer to this question: where is Jesus from? Where is this man Jesus from? Is Jesus from God? Yes or no? Are Jesus' words the words of God? Are Jesus' teachings the teachings of God? Is the way that Jesus commands us to live our lives the way that God commands us to live our lives? Is Jesus from God? Is Jesus God? Yes or no? And then the difference then between ending up then at a destination of spiritual sight or at a destination down that pathway of spiritual blindness is ultimately determined by one's response to the conclusion of that previous question. Is Jesus from God? Yes or no? And the absolutely certain, spiritually blind religious people who say, no, Jesus is not from God. The teachings of Jesus are not the teachings of God. The words of Jesus are not the words of God. The commands of Jesus are not the commands of God. This is how the spiritually certain, spiritually blind religious people respond, is that at very best then, what Jesus has to say is merely a suggestion. What Jesus has to say is merely Jesus' opinion, which carries no more weight than any other human's opinion, right? Because Jesus is not God. He's just another dude. And so then, for the religious people who answer the question, where is Jesus from? Is he from God? No. Then the way that Jesus commands us to do life, it's just a suggestion, just another opinion. And for most of us, for most people in this day of age, Jesus' opinion on how to do life is usually, plays second fiddle at best to our own opinion of how to do life. And our own opinion on how to do life is usually fronted with a phrase that sounds something like this. Well, this is what I think. Well, this is what I think. Ever heard that one? Ever said that one? Well, this is what I think. And so when you think about this, the spiritually blind, the blind religious, the certain people do life in religious obedience to our own opinions. The spiritually blind respond then to this question of, where is Jesus from? Is he from God? No, we respond by calling ourselves Lord. This is what I think. And living our lives and bowing down our lives in obedient worship to the God of self. So, the absolutely certain, spiritually blind, religious people. Right? In contrast, blind beggars, the blind beggars ultimately say, yes, Jesus is from God. Jesus is God. The words of Jesus are the words of God. The teachings of Jesus are the teachings of God. The commandments of Jesus on how to do life are the commandments of God for how to do life. And the blind beggars respond, as we saw at the end of chapter 9, blind beggars respond to their conclusion that Jesus is God by calling Jesus their Lord. You are my Lord. And they bow their lives down before him in obedient worship. And so the difference between ending up in a place of spiritual sight or a place of spiritual blindness hinges on the answer to this question: is Jesus from God? Yes or no? And that's the question we need to honestly answer for ourselves. Where is Jesus from? Is Jesus God? Are the teachings of Jesus the teachings of God? Are the words of Jesus the words of God? Is the way that Jesus commands us to do life the way that God commands us to do life? Yes or no? And then depending on our answer to that question, where is Jesus from, a second question then we need to ask ourselves is then, if we say yes, is Jesus my God? Is Jesus my Lord? Is Jesus the one before whom I bow down my life in obedient worship? So here's the key idea I want for us to walk away with from John chapter 9. It's this, that spiritually seeing is blindly following Jesus. People who see rightly follow Jesus as from God. People who see rightly follow Jesus as God. People who see rightly follow Jesus as their God. They follow the words of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus as the teachings of their God. Jesus' followers blindly follow Jesus. Let's say that together. Jesus' followers blindly follow Jesus. Now, that bugs us, doesn't it, a little bit? Doesn't that bug us a little bit? Blindly follow, right? Because blind obedience is a bad thing, right? We got all sorts of bad associations, and honestly, a lot of those bad associations, or some of those, are probably legitimate, but it wasn't that we were blindly following Jesus. We were blindly following somebody who claimed to be following Jesus, but they weren't, right? That's not blind obedience. We could easily spend an additional hour this morning sorting out various conceptions and misconceptions of what it means and it doesn't mean to blindly follow Jesus. But for the sake of time, here's the simplest way to think of it this morning. Listen to this. Every single one of you is blindly following somebody. Every single one of us is blindly following somebody or something. Now, how can I say that? Because not a single one of us knows what's around the bend, do we? None of us know. None of us knows what's around the corner of the road of life, and none of us then can see absolutely what's around that curve in such a way that we know exactly how to navigate the road of life. And so every single one of us is navigating life. We're following somebody's roadmap. We're blindly following somebody's roadmap into what we don't know, right? Every single one of us is blindly following somebody. And we're either following blindly Jesus' roadmap, this is how you do it, or you are following the roadmap of somebody or something that claims to be from God. It might be, a different religion than the one that points to Jesus as being from God, right? So you're either following Jesus as being from God, you're following some other way that says it's from God, or the third option, and this is the most common option, is we're just we're blindly following ourselves. Well, how are we navigating life? This is what I think. This is what I think. So we must carefully guard ourselves from chafing against this statement that we must blindly follow Jesus, because every single one of us is blindly following someone. And for many people, it's ourselves. We blindly follow, as the words of wisdom, we blindly follow as the words of how we should do life, a statement that says, well, this is what I think. We bow our lives down and we worship and give obedient worship to the God of self. Every single one of us is blindly following someone. Jesus' followers who are progressing down a pathway towards spiritual sight blindly follow Jesus. And so I just want to ask you this morning, who are you blindly following? What are you blindly following? What is it that you have said in your life? Who is it that you have said in your life is from God? These are the words of God. These are the teachings of God. These are the instructions of God on how to do life. Is it Jesus or is it yourself? Who do you bow your life before and call my Lord?